Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada for Reason to Resist on June 16th, 2025. Since Israel attacked Iran 3 days ago, the so-called mainstream discourse in the West has been brimming with claims and proclamations that Israel has a right to defend itself. But there have been few, if any, competent analyses of the legality of Israel's actions. As many of you will know, I'm a lawyer, and in my professional judgment, which I've expressed and explained repeatedly over the last 3 days, Israel had no lawful justification for attacking Iran. Moreover, Israel's attacks, in my view, constitute a frontal assault on the UN Charter, as well as other principles of international law. But I wanted to explore this with a member of the bar whom I followed for many years and who is truly expert in these matters to a greater degree than I am, to see where his views lie. And that lawyer is Craig Mokhiber. I know that many of you will know of Craig from his outspoken advocacy for the legal rights of the Palestinian people. He's an American lawyer, a former United Nations human rights official, and a specialist in international human rights law, policy, and methodology. And on October 28, 2023, 3 weeks after Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza began, Craig stepped down as the director of the New York office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights 4 days before he was due to retire. And in his final letter to High Commissioner Volker Türk, Craig harshly criticized the organization's response to Israel's war on Gaza, calling Israel's military intervention a textbook genocide. And if ever there were prophetic words, those were it. And he also accused the UN of failing to act. Thank you so much for joining us today, Craig.
Happy to be with you, Dimitri. Thank you.
Craig, I'd like to begin with Israel's characterization of its attacks on Iran as preemptive. Over and over again, the Western corporate media have repeated this characterization without a hint of skepticism or criticism. And I have a few questions for you about this, and I'd like to bundle them together. First, does international law permit preemptive military strikes by one state upon another? And if so, in what conditions? And second, do you think that those conditions were satisfied in the case of Israel's attacks on Iran?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's really important to situate these attacks on Iran in a broader context and a broader trend of lawlessness on the part of the Israeli regime. A state does not carry out such blatant violations of international law unless it's drunk on impunity. And just in recent months, you talked about, October of 2023 and what's happened since. Just in recent months, you've got the Israeli regime has carried out genocide and apartheid in Palestine. It carried out a transnational terrorism attack in Lebanon with bombing pagers, thousands of armed attacks on Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, the unlawful occupation of Palestinian, Lebanese, and Syrian territory, a number of extrajudicial executions on foreign territory, most recently the assault and commandeering of the Madeleine, the humanitarian flotilla ship in international waters. At the same time, as you will know, it's been using its proxies in Western countries to harass human rights defenders, to corrupt Western governments. It is a state that stockpiles nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. It allows no international inspections of its nukes. It has not ratified the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is a state that is run by a far-right, deeply racist, and fundamentally violent regime. And despite all of that, and in part, responsible for all of that, is that the West, led by the US, but also other Western countries, have granted impunity to the Israeli regime that no other state has enjoyed. And that impunity, as any lawyer will tell you is predictable, has led to serial criminality. So much so that not only is Israel threatening the entire region, potentially it's threatening peace and security globally. And there's no doubt that the reason that Iran was in the crosshairs of the Israeli regime is because it represents a rare element in the region, and that's the element of deterrence. I can say more about that, but I want to answer your question. And Dimitri, you know that in the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law, they're based on some old notions of jus ad bellum and jus in bello, right? Jus ad bellum is whether the reason for using armed force is justified in the first place. And in this case, what you see is an act of aggression, right? The Israeli regime's attack on Iran was unprovoked. That's a crime under international law. It was a very treacherous attack because it was launched in the middle of US negotiations, and it even targeted the Iranian official who was in charge of those negotiations. And by the way, I have to say, right after Israel cut off the internet in Gaza, drawing this digital curtain around its genocide happening there, and I would just encourage all of your viewers to keep paying attention to what's happening in Palestine, even as the aggression of Israel extends elsewhere in the region. But this idea of Israel just attacking Iran as it did, this is a violation of Article 51 of the UN Charter. Article 51 of the UN Charter provides for self-defense to an armed attack. If you have not been subjected to an armed attack, as Israel was not from Iran when it launched this attack, that constitutes the crime of aggression in international law. It's a violation of this very fundamental provision that prohibits the threat of force or the use of force. And when that force is used anyway without the authorization of the Security Council or in self-defense, it's the crime of aggression. Now, Israel proxies love to dig out this idea of anticipatory self-defense or preemptive strikes, right? And this will be familiar to many of your listeners and viewers who remember the Bush administration and the lead up to the US aggression in Iraq, also trying to make these arguments of anticipatory self-defense. It was dubious then, and it's dubious now. As a legal argument, it doesn't hold any water. The intent of the UN Charter, which is a binding treaty on all member states, was to prohibit armed attacks unless authorized by the Security Council or in self-defense. They've tried to carve out, some commentators have tried to carve out a middle ground saying that, well, maybe you can launch an attack if you think an attack is imminent, but it hasn't happened yet. That is very challenged in international law, but it clearly isn't even the case here, where there was no imminent attack on Israel taking place. So they couldn't have even made that claim, which is already outside the boundaries of international law. Now, of course, you know, Israel is a lawless regime. I don't think we need any more evidence of that. And so it doesn't need legal arguments, but its proxies tried to find legal arguments. And so they've tried to stretch the concept of self-defense even further in this case by claiming that, you know, somehow Israel has the right to attack anybody who might someday in the future decide to attack Israel. So in this case, their basic argument was Iran might one day, okay, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, we agree, but one day they might develop nuclear weapons and they might use them on Israel if they develop them, and therefore Israel has no choice but to attack Iran now. Clearly, as a matter of international law, that is impermissible, and as a matter of logic, it's also absurd. If that were to be a rule, any state could lawfully attack any other state at any time just by claiming there might be a potential future threat. And that would effectively annul the UN Charter, would annul all of international law on the use of force. But I have to say, Dimitri, for Israel, this makes perfect sense to them in the way that they view the world, because Israel is, in essence, an annihilatory state. It's at the very core of the way that state functions. It's a state that was created in violence. It's a state that exists by virtue of violence. And it's a state that is sustained by constant violence. And that, you know, official ideology of the state is premised on a very militarized conception of security that essentially says that anyone who does not submit to us must be destroyed. Otherwise, they may come back to fight us sometime. So in practical terms, that has meant genocide against the indigenous people of Palestine is okay, indeed necessary. It has meant that constant aggression against the Israeli regime's neighbors are okay, indeed necessary, and that this very obviously unlawful attack on Iran was not only okay, but was necessary in the eyes of the Israelis. But even under the broadest possible arguments of anticipatory self-defense, which again is rejected by every credible international lawyer, Israel's use of force would still be illegal in this case. And it's not a close call. You know, first, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. That's not disputed. Two, there's no evidence that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. 3, there's no evidence that it would use those weapons against Israel, even if it had those weapons. 4, there is no imminent threat, as is required in this analysis. And finally, the Israeli regime has not exhausted peaceful means, as would be required by international law, even if there was a threat. So just in strictly legal terms, and it's not a gray area and it's not a hard case, this is old-fashioned aggression, which is considered the supreme crime in international law.
Mm-hmm. So I feel kind of silly having to ask this question, but that's the nature of the discourse around Israel. It's just so simplistic and silly, so I'm going to ask it anyways. Having been subjected to the crime of aggression, broadly speaking, what is Iran lawfully entitled to do in response?
Iran has a right to defend itself from these attacks by the Israeli regime, including through the use of armed force. That right extends right up until there is an alternative solution, for example, one imposed by the Security Council, which, as you know, has been effectively rendered useless by the use of the U.S. veto on behalf of its partner in the Middle East, Israel. So Iran has a right to use armed force to defend itself. It's incredible when you see the statements coming out of Western leaders who immediately parroted the Israeli propaganda talking points after Israel carried out an act of aggression on Iran. And then they opened their statements by saying Israel has the right to defend itself. No, Israel is the aggressor. It has no right to defend itself in these circumstances. The party that has a right to defend itself is the victim, which in this case was Iran. So Iran has that right to defend itself, including through the use of armed force.
So you quite rightly pointed out, Craig, that there's a lot of history here, and the history did not begin on the day that Israel commenced this latest aggression. I'd like to ask you about 2 events in the recent past involving Israel, the United States, and Iran, because I think it's important context, and in and of themselves raise very serious questions about Iran's entitlement to use force. First of all, in January 2020, the Trump administration ordered the assassination by U.S. forces or intelligence services, it's unclear which, of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. They not only killed him, the Americans also killed officials of the Iraqi government. Could you talk to us about, the United States tried in some half-assed way to claim that there was a legal justification for this. In your view, was there any legal basis to the assassination of Soleimani by the United States? And if not, what was Iran entitled to do in response to that crime?
No, there clearly was no legal justification. That was an extrajudicial execution. That was an assassination. That was a crime in international law. The United States had no right to do that. It violated a number of international law. You carried that act out on the sovereign territory of Iraq, which was a breach of Iraqi sovereignty. And it carried out an extrajudicial execution. The U.S. has been carrying out so many extrajudicial executions, especially since it's invented war on terror in the early 2000s, that it's begun to believe its own propaganda, that it can just fly around and murder people at will. International law recognizes no such right in the hands of the U.S. or of any other government. What could the Iranians do? Well, they could respond with peaceful means. They could seek accountability in courts of law through diplomatic processes, through intergovernmental processes. They could interpret it as an act of war. I'm not sure that the assassination of one official that is wise to respond with military force in such circumstances. But they certainly had opportunities to try to answer that crime through pursuing justice in the rule of law, whether that was through a state-to-state case in the International Court of Justice, whether that was through seeking criminal accountability in its own courts or in a third-party court, which it has every right to do, or, as I say, through diplomatic means. Now, obviously, Iran is in an unfriendly neighborhood where so many of the governments of the region have either been corrupted and captured by the United States, or have been destroyed because they refuse to be corrupted and captured by the United States. So Iran doesn't have many friends for that kind of multilateral response. But they certainly were the victims in that case. And the murder of Soleimani was a crime under international law for which there is no justification. If there were, it would mean that it would be okay, by extension, for the Iranians to assassinate, the Pete Hegseth, or the Secretary of Defense at the time, which would be the equivalent, assassinating senior officials of governments that, by the way, you're not even at war with, and not on the battlefield, and a thousand other qualifications. So clearly, that is unlawful. That is undesirable. That governments just assassinate representatives of each other's governments. And it was a crime.
And the other event from the recent past, again, I'm asking you these questions. It should be obvious to any, not just lawyers, but to any rational, decent human being what the answers to these questions are. But they are so absent from the discourse in the West that I feel it necessary to put them to you nonetheless. The other event I want to ask you about is that on April 1st, 2024, last year, Israel conducted an airstrike on the Iranian embassy complex in Damascus, destroying the building housing Iran's consular section, killing 16 people, including 8 officers of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and 2 Syrian civilians. Could you tell us about, broadly speaking, the legality of that and what Iran, in your opinion, would be entitled to have done in response to that act?
Well, obviously, that is a massive, unlawful attack on the sovereignty of Iran, but it is also an attack on civilian installations. It's an attack on a protected group, which is to say diplomats. They are off limits. You can't go bombing people's embassies. You have to respect embassies and consulates and diplomatic installations. The whole international system falls apart if we can start assassinating each other's diplomats. That's the end of the UN. That's the end of bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. That's the end of consular services and the protection of civilians abroad. It's the end of safe travel for everybody. So it was a very serious cluster of crimes that was perpetrated in that attack. What could the Iranians do? They could, again, same thing. They could pursue criminal accountability for the perpetrators of that crime. Again, they could interpret it as an act of war, but they couldn't respond in kind because crimes are not allowed under international humanitarian law, under international criminal law, under international human rights law. The fact that one side perpetrates a crime doesn't entitle the other side to perpetrate the same crimes. And I think that I have to say that Iran showed then and since great restraint in the face of all of the criminal activities being perpetrated against it, first by the U.S. and by the Israeli regime, and I think correctly, didn't cross over into the criminality of these perpetrators. But again, the problem of the 21st century is the problem of impunity. And nowhere is that impunity more obvious than in the Israeli regime and in the U.S. state. That's why, a lot of folks think that we've entered a period in which international law itself is on trial. International institutions themselves are on trial. That if you can have this kind of blatant criminality, this endless impunity by a few perpetrators in the international system, that the legitimacy, the credibility of those international laws and systems are very much called into question. And, even though these are incomplete, inchoate, sometimes very weak, sometimes very inconsistent laws and systems at the international level, they are the beginning of something that says that it's not just the law of the jungle anymore. And if they are destroyed completely, as they are on the verge of being destroyed because of the impunity of the Israelis and its American sponsors and its other Western sponsors and so on, it's going to be a long time before we see even the beginning of the building of an international system that's more norm-based, that prohibits this kind of use of force and these kinds of crimes. And then we're back to the law of the jungle. So the whole world has something to lose here in the face of Israeli impunity, in the face of U.S. impunity. And we should all be working toward a system where these rogue actors are held accountable.
Yes, the Palestinians on the front line of a war that implicates us all. I could not agree more. Let's talk about the uranium enrichment issue. Again, a basic question of international law, but one that nonetheless is neglected in the so-called mainstream discourse. Iran has repeatedly insisted throughout the time that the United States and Israel have been threatening it with attack because of its nuclear enrichment program, that it has the right to civilian peaceful use of nuclear energy, and for that purpose to engage in enrichment. And oftentimes when you see the corporate media reporting on this, they'll put, quoting Iran, they'll put the word right in quotation marks as though this is a contentious claim. In your opinion, is it a contentious claim? Or does Iran have the right to use nuclear energy for civilian peaceful purposes?
Of course, Iran is a sovereign state. It absolutely has the right to develop a peaceful nuclear program like any other state. And the arrogance of foreign regimes imposing restrictions on the Iranian state in its quest to have peaceful nuclear energy that it needs for its own development, for the well-being of its own people, I think is outrageous. I mean, I think to some degree, not that it's not an issue, but it's kind of a symbol of a bigger issue, because this is really a war for U.S. and therefore Israeli hegemony in the region, right? Iran is being targeted because it's the last independent state that's still standing in the region. After the corruption, as I said, and the capture of so many Arab governments by the U.S., the destruction of those that refused to submit, Iraq, Libya, Syria, one by one, just torn apart for refusing to submit to the U.S. and Israeli project. Iran is now the last frontline state that refuses to submit, and that refuses at the same time, by the way, to normalize. And I'm not here to sing the praises of Iran. I have no connection to Iran. I have no great love for its form of government or anything else. But it's a sovereign state that has stood up and said, we will not normalize settler colonialism, apartheid, and genocide in Palestine. We will not abandon the Palestinian people. We will not surrender control of our natural resources to the U.S. empire. And we will not give up our right as a sovereign state to develop peaceful nuclear energy, a right that all states have. And it's for those reasons that the U.S.-Israel axis has been working for decades, this is not new, to strangle the economy of Iran, to destabilize the country, to try to overthrow the government of Iran, and to put in place, as it had with the Shah, a puppet regime that would be more friendly to the U.S. and its project in the Middle East. And now, after all those years of interference and sanctions and other means of attacking the Iranian people, now they've moved to direct military aggression. And in doing so, dusting off this old weapons of mass destruction justifications that they used in Iraq, that they were caught on and called out on for it being fraudulent. And yet they feel like enough time has passed that they can make the same kind of arguments here. And sadly, in corporate media in the West, it works perfectly well. You'll even hear these old lines about, well, the smoking gun will be a mushroom cloud. Utter nonsense. Flies in the face of facts and law and logic, and yet it doesn't stop them from using all of those. So, yeah, absolutely, Iran has a right to develop peaceful nuclear energy that includes enrichment, significant enrichment as well, which is necessary for that. And by the way, on the nuclear weapon issue, Iran is a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran cooperates and allows international inspections. It cooperates with the IAEA in spite of being given quite a hard time within that intergovernmental body. Where Israel, which is the one that is attacking Iran because of its peaceful nuclear program, has stockpiles of nuclear weapons undeclared that it allows no international inspections of, and it has not ratified the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself. So, I mean, the irony, the arrogance of these assertions is a little bit too much sometimes, I think, to bear. But yes, they absolutely have that right.
So my understanding, and I'm certainly no expert in this area, but that in order to operate a civilian nuclear reactor, it is necessary, generally speaking, to enrich uranium to the level of 5%. And under the JCPOA, Iran was agreed for a period of, I believe, 12 years to limit its enrichment to something like 3.57%. slightly below the 5% threshold. How that enabled Iran to continue to operate a civilian nuclear reactor, I don't know. But in any event, they agreed to that. And the IAEA confirmed, right up until the moment that Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, that Iran was complying with its obligations under the JCPOA. Now, I recently was in Iran about a month ago, and I and some other journalists were afforded the opportunity to meet with the spokesperson of the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization. And one of the questions that I asked him, and for the first thing that happened was they took us for a tour of the facility. They explained to us that actually in order to operate reactors for research purposes, they had to enrich to the level of 20%. But there were reports at the time that Iran had actually enriched to the level of 60%. And it's my understanding that in order to develop a nuclear weapon, you have to enrich beyond the level of 90%. So they were still significantly below the nuclear weapons threshold of enrichment, but well above the 20% for research reactors. So I asked the representative of the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization why they had done that and how they reconciled that with their obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And he responded by saying that there were other states that are parties to the treaty, non-nuclear states, that have agreed or are involved in the enrichment of uranium well beyond 60%. And he gave me the example of Australia, which has just agreed to purchase nuclear-powered submarines in order for those submarines to use nuclear energy for propulsion. The uranium has to be enriched to the level of 93%. So sorry for all of this detail and so forth, but my question essentially is this. What do you make of this response? That because a lot is being said about Iran's enrichment to the level of 60%, and the United States government and Israel are pretending that that was some kind of a game changer. They were on the cusp of having enriched uranium to the level necessary for the development of a nuclear weapon. Does that change the legal analysis in your view? Do you think that Iran was entitled to enrich to the level of 60%, even though, strictly speaking, it wasn't necessary to do so in order to maintain civilian nuclear energy reactors?
Well, Iran may have all sorts of reasons for wanting to have more enrichment than a particular frame. I mean, leverage alone. Remember, this is a country that's been under sanctions and pressure, for years and years and years over this question. It may have wanted leverage. It may have had good civilian scientific reasons for wanting higher levels of enrichment. It may have been asserting its sovereignty. None of that changes the legality of the attack by the Israeli regime on the Iranians. None of that qualifies as an armed attack that would allow Israel then in self-defense to attack. So that crime stands. I think the other thing you have to look at is that, Iran is repeatedly, Iran entered in good faith into the JCPOA and tried in good faith to remain even as the U.S., pulled out of the JCPOA. Iran and every other country in the region virtually has said that they would agree to a nuclear-free Middle East, the whole region. Of course, that would mean that Israel would have to give up its nuclear weapons, and neither the U.S. nor Israel is willing to take that deal. So, 60% or 20% or whatever is the percentage, I don't think changes the situation here, which is that you have a country that wants a peaceful nuclear energy program, that has a right to have that program, that has said that it's not interested in nuclear weapons, that would have no desire to have nuclear weapons. Claims to have no desire to have nuclear weapons. Their supreme leader has issued a fatwa against building nuclear weapons, as a matter of fact. But there would be no reason for anyone in the region to want nuclear weapons if it weren't for the fact that the most aggressive and violent regime in the neighborhood, which is the Israeli regime, is a nuclear-armed regime. And what should be happening for people who care about nuclear weapons and the risk that they bring is they should be putting their energy in trying and working toward disarmament, nuclear disarmament of the state of Israel, just as South Africa voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons program. Libya voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons program. The same needs to happen with regard to the Israeli regime, which is a very dangerous and aggressive regime, and yet, focusing upon Iran's, civilian use of nuclear power instead of actual nuclear weapons present in the neighborhood, it seems to me reveals the whole game. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not a scientist. Levels of enrichment are all Greek to me, if I could say, Dimitri. But it seems to me that, while we're focusing on these issues, I mean, I highly doubt that if the enrichment levels were half of what they are, that we would be in a different situation. This is about regime change. This is about the hegemony of the U.S. and Israeli project in the region. It's about maintaining the absolute dominance of the Israeli regime in the region, and it's not about anything, so noble as trying to rid the region of nuclear weapons, because nobody's addressing the nuclear weapons that actually exist in the region, which are only Israeli nuclear weapons.
Now, I want to talk a little more about the IAEA's response to the current ongoing attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. The head of the IAEA, I believe it's Mario Grossi, on June 13th, the day after the attacks commenced, put out a statement about the bombing of nuclear facilities in Iran by Israel. And I'd like to read to you part of the statement. He said, all these developments are deeply concerning. I have repeatedly stated that nuclear facilities must never be attacked, regardless of the context or circumstances, as it could harm both people and the environment. Such attacks have serious implications for nuclear safety, security, and safeguards, as well as regional and international peace and security. He then goes on and he recalls numerous General Conference resolutions on the topic of military attacks against nuclear facilities. He cites Resolution 444, Resolution 533, which provide inter alia that, quote, any armed attack on and threat against nuclear facilities devoted to peaceful purposes constitutes a violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter, international law, and the statute of the agency. Now, let's just ignore for a second the reality with which I am in complete agreement, your position with which I'm in complete agreement that this was an act of aggression and that there was no justification for attacking Iran at all. Could you talk to us about the legality or lack thereof of attacking nuclear facilities? I'm also most interested to hear your thoughts about the IAEA's dealings in general with Iran, and whether you believe that its response to this particular criminality has been robust enough.
Well, first, no, I don't. And again, this is not a gray area. So we spoke about the crime of aggression, which is the first piece here. But then there are several crimes that have been perpetrated by the Israeli regime, following that aggression, following that initial crime. And one of them is that international humanitarian law prohibits attacks on so-called dangerous facilities like nuclear power plants and other facilities if they contain what international humanitarian law refers to as dangerous forces, like radiation, for example. Those are generally prohibited under international humanitarian law. And of course, the IAEA has itself declared that attacks on nuclear facilities are prohibited, they're a violation of international law, and they're a violation of UN Charter, according to the IAEA, so even beyond international humanitarian law. The reason that these facilities are protected under international law is because of the potential for severe harm to the civilian population if they're attacked. This is common sense, isn't it, right? And there are very, very few and very narrow circumstances laid out in the law, but even these circumstances would be hard to actually find a case, because only if a facility is being used directly for military purposes, for example, that facility is being used to launch attacks against the enemy, then they could lose their protected status and become legitimate targets. But even then, only if first it's a legitimate military objective. This is clearly not a legitimate military objective. This is not something that is firing at the Israelis. The attack itself is an act of aggression, so it's not a lawful military objective. And then even if it's a legitimate military objective, the attack has to be necessary for that legitimate objective. And necessity here, clearly not the case. We were literally in the middle of negotiations when this attack took place. So there are peaceful things. So necessity fails. And if you do it, you have to give warning under international law, right? So even if you meet all of those requirements, then you have to give an effective warning, right? And then even if you've given an effective warning, the military action that you take against that facility has to meet a number of humanitarian law requirements. And you know them, right? Precaution. So you have to take necessary precautions so nobody is going to be harmed by a leak or anything else. Distinction between civilians, and we can talk more about how they have not exercised distinction in these attacks, and proportionality. And proportionality is almost impossible to meet that when it comes to attacking a nuclear facility because of what can happen. The impact of that attack on civilians, transborder impacts, and so on. So meeting that test of proportionality would be almost impossible for a nuclear facility because of the risk of radiation leaks and dissemination of that and so on. And then international humanitarian law also prohibits any means of warfare that can cause widespread or long-term damage to the natural environment. Those acts are prohibited. Clearly, an attack on a nuclear facility could result in long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. And then finally, I would say, there is also in international humanitarian law the principle of neutrality. That means, while you're fighting with each other, you can't cause transborder damage to neutral states. So, for example, bombing a nuclear facility that would release nuclear emissions that would then affect neighboring states, and who knows how far those poisons would travel. So there is no way that you could make a compelling argument that Israel's attacks on these Iranian nuclear facilities is anything but a crime under international humanitarian law, and that's made very clear by multiple provisions in international humanitarian law. And that's just one. So there's aggression, there's attack on nuclear facilities, but this whole thing has been a series of violations that Western media is talking about as if these are just normal part of a military conflict between two sides. The Israeli regime has already killed over 200 Iranians. Most of those, according to reports coming out of the country, are civilians, including women and children and civilian men. It has targeted, and that's in violation of international humanitarian law, it's targeted apartment buildings, it's targeted media buildings. It just blew up the state broadcaster. It hit at least one hospital. It murdered several Iranian scientists who, by the way, are civilians and are protected persons. It's violating the principle of distinction because it's targeting protected persons, because it's targeting civilian infrastructure. That's not allowed. This killing of scientists, the way it's reported, as if this is some kind of James Bond movie or something. If a scientist is integrated into the military, not a civilian scientist working for the military, but is actually integrated into the military, okay, then they might become a legitimate target in some circumstances. But most scientists, including the Iranian scientists, are civilians, even if they were working on weapons. And by the way, these scientists are not even working on weapons; they're working on nuclear energy. But even if they were, they would still be civilians, and targeting them would be unlawful. And you also cannot unlawfully target people in their homes, as these people were targeted in their homes, just because they're a scientist who might someday work on weapons, which is the Israeli logic. That's the crime in international humanitarian law of murder. And then targeting civilian infrastructure like the apartment buildings that they had full of civilians just to kill a scientist, whether that scientist is civilian or military, would not pass the international humanitarian law tests of precaution and distinction and proportionality and all of this. So that makes it unlawful as well. And attacks on scientists because they might build a bomb someday. I mean, they're writing their own rules as they go along. Those are not legitimate military objectives, right? Mm-hmm. In the current conflict, these scientists are not threatening Israeli forces in any way. They're not armed and not involved in fighting in any way. So they are protected. It would be the equivalent, Dimitri, if we were to accept that argument. That would be like shooting all the males in the country because they might someday become soldiers. That's not allowed. These assassinations are not allowed. And by the way, even beyond the attacks on the nuclear infrastructure, these attacks on energy infrastructure is generally protected under international humanitarian law because it's essential to civilian survival. And again, only in very narrow circumstances can they become a military target, like when soldiers are firing from there. And you meet all of the other requirements of international humanitarian law. In the current conflict, you can't make that argument. Attacks on energy facilities because they might someday be, cause some harm is not acceptable. So this is not just the umbrella crime of aggression. This is a cluster of crimes that are being perpetrated by the Israeli regime in its attacks on Iran.
So just because I'm most interested to hear your thoughts about this, to put a finer point on it, what do you make of the IAEA's response to Israel's attacks on these facilities? And generally, what do you make of the IAEA's treatment of Iran in the inspection process and related matters? Do you think it's been a neutral arbiter? Do you think it's been a credible player in terms of trying to apply the rules and laws relating to nuclear energy with integrity?
Well, as we know from all of the revelations that came out of U.S. interference with the IAEA around the Iraq inspections, that there had been not just penetration, but of the IAEA by U.S. intelligence operatives, but there had been real interference, including threats from the United States government to force the IAEA to say some things and not to say some other things. And that's decades ago. I have no idea how much better or worse it's become since then. But in spite of that, and concerns that sometimes it is a little bit too Western dominated, as many international institutions, I can tell you, after 32 years in the UN are, despite that, Iran has managed to maintain a good relationship with the IAEA. Let me say, the IAEA has been able to function. It has mostly given clean bills of health through its engagement, especially since the years of the JCPOA. And even this most recent report, it didn't say they're building a bomb, we have to do something. It talked about some areas of concern, effectively. And those areas of concern are usually resolved between the agency and its inspectors and the member state, and probably would have been. So it is a little bit strange that they released this, I think, very odd statement, and then the next day, effectively, Israel started attacking. Whether there was any coordination there, I can't say. I can say that the IAEA is not as insulated from pressure of powerful member states as it needs to be to preserve its credibility. We know that from the Iraq time when inspectors, and by the way, from Syria as well, right? The inspectors there being pressured. So despite all of that, the cooperation was continuing. And there was no justification, even in that odd statement that was just issued, for the use of armed force against Iran or its facilities. And you are absolutely right. The real issue here for the IAEA is somebody is bombing nuclear facilities. I mean, that should be concern number one. As, by the way, it was with the nuclear reactors in the Ukraine, when it became, sort of the main area of focus. It should be here as well. And soft statements about both sides reflecting blah, 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 blah is not going to help us. Israel needs to be read the Riot Act for jeopardizing civilian life, not just in Iran, but more broadly in the region by attacking these facilities.
Right. So I'd like to switch now to the subject of collective defense. And the context for my question to you, Craig, you may have seen these reports. There have been reports that Pakistan, well, this is not simply a report, Pakistan's government has come out and said that it's necessary for the Muslim world to stand with Iran. And that if they don't stand with Iran, the other Muslim states are next. Now, what's not confirmed, but what I've seen reports of, is that there are convoys of trucks crossing from Pakistan into Iran, potentially to provide military weaponry or other material necessary for the defense of Iran. And then I've seen reports, which are credible but not confirmed, that there have been cargo planes flying out of China into Iran, the contents of which are not known. But again, potentially they would include military equipment. Now, Article 51 of the United Nations Charter states, in pertinent part, nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. Now, none of these states, neither of these states, China or Pakistan, nor Russia for that matter, has entered into a NATO-style treaty with Iran, even though they do have, strategic partnerships, at least Russia and China do with Iran. None of them contains an Article 5 provision, Article 5 of the NATO treaty type provision, where the member states will consider coming to the defense of any member that is attacked. That being said, despite the absence of such a treaty provision in the bilateral relations between these states, would countries like China, Russia, and Iran be entitled to come to the defense of Pakistan, China, and Russia? Would they be entitled, or other countries entitled, to come to the defense of Iran, despite the absence of a NATO-type obligation, because it has been subjected to an unlawful act of aggression? And if so, what is the nature of the assistance that they would be able to provide lawfully?
So the lawful actor here is the government of Iran. They have been subjected to an act of aggression in international law, and that triggers a right for Iran to defend itself against that aggression until the Security Council is able to act effectively. And that's a big until, because of, anything anybody knows about the United Nations these days, after a couple of years of genocide, is that the Security Council is not able to act when it comes to act in the way it's supposed to when it comes to Israel. So that period of the right to self-defense continues until there is another solution. Iran, in its self-defense, it has the right to ally itself with anyone he wants to. They have a right to buy arms or to receive arms for its self-defense. I mean, it would be really ironic if anyone like the U.S. were to argue that it weren't, since the U.S. and France and the United Kingdom and Germany are arming Israel to the teeth, even as it perpetrates aggression. So they are supporting the aggression, and the U.S. is going further than that. By the way, I think the U.K. with its flights and others, are actually participating in defense of Israel in its war with Iran. Iran has the right to do the same, more so than Israel, which is the aggressor in this case. So if it needs assistance from others, they could do so. Now, normally, collective self-defense is something that you would go to the Security Council to get authorization, but we are in a very gray area where the Security Council is not able to act, and this is not something that's going to be resolved by uniting for peace resolution in the General Assembly, whatever the case may be. So there is a right to collective self-defense. There are specific conditions that are necessary for it. Iran has to ask for it, is the first condition. And then, it would have to operate within that window of the right to self-defense for as long as that window was open. So I don't know. I'd be very surprised if it were to go beyond armaments. But anything can happen in the world that we see now. I mean, this actually, reveals why this is such a dangerous situation. One of the biggest global fault lines runs right through the Middle East. You could see very powerful forces aligned against each other if something very significant doesn't change in the near future to rein in the Israeli impunity, which is underwritten by the West and which is what causes Israel to behave as a serial criminal. Its actions becoming worse and worse and more dangerous as time goes on. that impunity, is not met with meaningful deterrence from the other side. So it's buttressed by the US and the UK and Germany and others, but it's not met with meaningful resistance from the rest of the world. And the Security Council is out of the equation because of the US veto. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's so dangerous. You can see these things really spiraling out of control.
Yeah, and this is precisely why I'm asking the question, because I can easily imagine a situation where, either with or without justification, the Americans and or the Israelis begin to accuse countries like China, Russia, and Pakistan, of providing armaments to Iran, and then invoke that potentially as some kind of a justification for taking hostile action against those states, whether of an economic or military nature. And I just want to underline this. Your view is that because Iran has been subjected to aggression, and even perhaps in the absence of aggression, they would have every right to acquire armaments from those states or other states in order to enhance their ability to defend themselves. And that would not provide a justification to Israel and the United States to take any kind of an economic or military retaliation against them.
No, I mean, U.S. sanctions are not acts of international law. In fact, most of them are unlawful. These unilateral coercive measures that are imposed by the United States. The U.S. is, it may be an empire, but it doesn't have authority over international law. And in the end, and I don't want us to be, because we're two lawyers talking here, to be sounding like the law has all of the answers. Sometimes it doesn't. I mean, all of those NATO acts of collective self-defense, so-called, first, were not acts of self-defense. Many times they were acts of aggression, especially when those forces were extended beyond Europe and the North Atlantic, so-called, and were not lawful under international law. But it's a reality that these were not authorized, right, under international law. Not Iraq, not Kosovo, not, you name it, any place where we've seen these kinds of, not Syria, right? So if you ask me as a lawyer, I would say there are problems. If you ask me as somebody just functioning in the realm of logic, I would say that the central threat to international peace and security at this moment in history is Israeli impunity. And the lack of a deterrent, the lack of a counter force against Israeli impunity, and that Israeli impunity has U.S. and British and Canadian and lots of other facets to it. The lack of a counter force to that is what has emboldened Israel to continue this line of crimes, one right after another, with all of the danger that implies, not just for the region but globally. And so you would like to see more of a unified, collective, multilateral response that would contain Israel. Not, military force sometimes is necessary, but there's a lot more that could be done. Boycott, divest, sanctions, removing them from international organizations, which should have been done long ago. Military embargoes. There's a lot that these countries could do. Rather than just, whistling and looking the other way. And it's shameful that the entire Arab region has been inactive and even complicit in the crimes that are being perpetrated by Israel. It's shameful that the Security Council has thoroughly abdicated its responsibilities here. It's shameful that the General Assembly has not gone as far as it needs to. And it tells me, as somebody who has worked within those systems for a very long time, that new multilateral collective endeavors of states to counterbalance the threat are very, very important, and whether it's in the economic field, like the BRICS, whether it's the Hague group on the legal side of things coming together to oppose, those states coming together to oppose the genocide in Palestine, or the kinds of arrangements, collective security arrangements that you're hinting at now, I think, they are absolutely necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would go further than, the law sometimes doesn't have an answer. Sometimes the law gives the wrong answer. For example, why does the United States have the lawful right to veto measures necessary to bring an end to a genocide? If that's not the wrong answer, I don't know what the hell is. But in any event, I want to go on to the subject of sanctions now and talk, if we could focus the remainder of our discussion on the genocide in Gaza. And thank you for being so patient with my rather fundamentalist questions about the law pertaining to Israel's attacks on Iran. I had a very interesting discussion recently in the course of doing an interview for Reason to Resist with the ambassador of the Russian Federation to Canada. And we sat down, we had an hour-long discussion in the embassy in Ottawa. And one of the questions I asked him was why the Russian Federation had not sanctioned Israel, despite the very pointed and harsh language being employed by Mr. Nebenza, I believe it is, the UN ambassador of the Russian Federation, in regard to Israel's crimes in Gaza. And what he said to me was this. He said, first of all, we don't engage in any arms trade with Israel. I said, well, does that mean you have a de facto arms embargo? He said, not really. We just don't trade in arms with Israel. And he said, furthermore, there's a substantial population of Russian citizens in Israel. He said, but the big issue for us is we are opposed to unilateral sanctions. And by that, I understood him to mean sanctions that have not been approved by the UN Security Council. However, as you well know, Craig, there is this provision under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, to which the Russian Federation is a signatory, which says that the parties to the Genocide Convention undertake to prevent and punish genocide. And now, I don't purport to be an expert in this area, but I would think that there are exceptions to the rule in international law. There are exceptions to the rule that sanctions can only be authorized by the UN Security Council. And one of them, if it isn't, it should be cases of potential genocide. In cases of that nature, where there's a material risk of genocide occurring, all members of the Genocide Convention have an obligation, with or without UN Security Council approval, to apply sanctions necessary to bring an end or prevent the genocide. What is your view about this? Do you think that the Russian Federation is justified in refraining from sanctioning Israel, even though it condemns its behavior, because the UN Security Council hasn't approved sanctions on Israel?
Yeah. No, I don't think it's justified. I mean, I understand the position of the Russian Federation in opposing unilateral coercive measures of the type that the U.S. has used to interfere with the domestic affairs of countries all around the world and to try to destabilize their economies, and in the process to violate the human rights of millions of people, imposing hardship on civilians because they don't like a particular government, for example. And Russia has always been a strong opponent of that in intergovernmental fora, and that's the correct line, because you're not supposed to impose these sanctions unilaterally in that way. But the kinds of measures that we're talking about with regard to Israel can no longer be called unilateral in the strict sense, because the International Court of Justice has ruled in successive advisory opinions and in its provisional measures under the genocide case against Israel that states are obliged to cut off all military, economic, trade, financial, diplomatic, and other relations with the Israeli regime in the occupied territories. So that has been a very clear finding, and all UN member states are obliged to do so, and almost none of them are meeting their obligations there. So that's not a unilateral sanction. That is a multilateral obligation that emerges from your membership in the UN, your ratification of the Charter, which is itself a treaty, and your obligations under the findings of the International Court of Justice. In addition to that, the International Court of Justice has issued a round of provisional measures that have also required member states not to be feeding into what Israel is doing in the occupied territories. So there's nothing unilateral or inappropriate about the imposition of these restrictions on the Israeli regime. To the contrary, it is the obligation of all UN member states to do so. Now, what you would like to see, we've got a resolution from the General Assembly just a few days ago that has language that says basically that all states should take whatever measures they can to hold the Israeli regime accountable. And that's the kind of general language that we're talking about. What the GA needs to do to make it easier for countries that are willing to take the right steps is, because you cannot get sanctions passed in the Security Council because of the US and UK and probably French vetoes, you can, under the so-called Uniting for Peace mechanism, take that case to the General Assembly, which is a more democratic body, one country, one vote with no vetoes, and you can adopt a resolution that calls on all member states to implement comprehensive sanctions, in all of those areas, as was done with South Africa under apartheid. Right? So there's precedent for this. It would make it clearer. This is what we've been pressing the General Assembly to do. They haven't done so yet. The next big opportunity is probably in September, when the 1-year time limit that the General Assembly and the International Court of Justice gave to the Israeli regime to end the occupation, when the time is up, then they're supposed to take measures, and those measures should be to make that clearer call for sanctions. Now, that's to make it easy for them. There is nothing stopping any state that really cares from taking those measures. What's really stopping most of these states, including those that have been harvesting fig leaves lately by saying they're going to sanction Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and maybe they're going to review some of the trade provisions and so on. The only thing stopping them is, one, for some of them, ideological alignment with the white supremacist settler colonial project of the Israelis in Palestine. Huge contracts for technology, including surveillance technology and other kind of technologies with the Israeli regime. Energy contracts and weapons contracts, and a whole series of relationships with financial and other implications. That includes the Russian Federation, by the way, has not cut off its relations in trade areas and other areas with the Israeli regime. For some countries, you've got some countries in the Pacific and in Africa that have people in government that are sort of these right-wing evangelical Christians that have adopted Christian Zionism and inserted it into their foreign policy. For others, it's a quid pro quo with the United States. We will cut off your aid if you vote against Israel or if you sanction Israel. These kinds of things. So it's really the only thing really stopping most of them is a lack of principle, a lack of commitment to the cause, and this kind of blind belief that what's happening now across the Middle East won't happen to them if they get on the wrong side of the empire. So I really think that what you're hinting at there, which is more multilateral, collective adoption of sanctions and embargoes of all kinds to hold the Israeli regime to account and change its behavior in doing so, that's the hope that we have. It's already coming from civil society. The vast majority of people in the world are on the side of Palestine and are horrified by the attacks on Iran and Yemen and others. And you're seeing, a mass movement in civil society like we've never seen before. And you're seeing all kinds of manifestations of that: the encampments in university campuses, the mass demonstrations in the streets of countries across the West, for example, the Freedom Flotilla, which is a people's movement as well, the People's March on Gaza, which is a people's movement as well, the People's Tribunal on Gaza that is operating, all of these things, and just the millions who are standing up despite the repression for standing up. The world is on the side of Palestine. The world is on the side of international law and justice. The world is on the side of non-aggression. The world is on the side of accountability for perpetrators and redress for victims. But the power centers, which is to say governments, are either directly involved in these crimes or in other ways complicit, or are just going along to make a buck. And that's the state of the universe in which we find ourselves at the moment, I'm afraid.
It is indeed. I want to be clear. I'm not only talking about Russia here. This is an argument I could just as easily have made with respect to China, which continues to be one of Israel's largest trading partners, notwithstanding the admirable statements it's made before the International Court of Justice in defense of the Palestinian people, notwithstanding its unequivocal condemnations of Israel, I, for the life of me, can't understand why a country with the economic resources of China or Russia would continue to trade with this pipsqueak Israel at a time when they themselves recognize that Israel is running roughshod over international law. It just boggles the mind. But I want to conclude with this question, Craig, and that is that the most admirable rapporteur for the human rights of the Palestinians living in the occupied territories, Francesca Albanese, has been outspoken in demanding that Israel be suspended from the United Nations. And recently I saw a direct appeal that she put on social media towards the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. I unfortunately wasn't able to find it before we began talking today, but as I recall, she was arguing in this statement that it wasn't necessary to wait for the United Nations Security Council to act to suspend Israel from the United Nations. Do you have a view about this? Is there a mechanism whereby the UN Secretary General or the General Assembly could suspend Israel without the imprimatur of the UN Security Council?
They could. So there is a precedent for this as well. It was used in the case of South Africa because, again, the US and the UK were vetoing attempts to remove apartheid South Africa from the United Nations. And what they did was they came up with a very clever and effective means, which was in the General Assembly, they withdrew the credentials, in the Credentials Committee of the General Assembly, they withdrew the credentials of South Africa at the time, preventing it from participating in the General Assembly or any of its subsidiary bodies, which was effectively a constructive suspension from the United Nations and kept it that way until the end of apartheid. The same thing could be done for the Israeli regime. There is a movement to try to make that happen. All it would require would be for the General Assembly to go along. You could get a majority of states to do so. And it's long overdue. I mean, if you think about what Israel has done, right? Israel is walking around with full credentials, participating in intergovernmental bodies in the UN, as it's committing these acts of aggression against Iran and so many other countries, against these transnational terrorism attacks, war crimes, crimes against humanity, apartheid, genocide. All of this is going on, but also because it is attacking the UN itself. Right? I mean, this is it has the world record for violating UN conventions, UN resolutions of the Security Council, the General Assembly, of the Human Rights Council, and so on. No other state of the orders of the International Court of Justice. Its defiance of Security Council resolutions alone is enough to trigger articles of the Charter that would sanction it. It's on trial for genocide in the World Court, which is a UN court. Its leaders are the subject of arrest warrants in the ICC for crimes against humanity, right? The World Court has found that it's perpetrating apartheid, that its occupation of the Palestinian territories is entirely unlawful, that it has to leave, it refuses to do so. It's attacking people, not just in Palestine, but in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, right? It's been found guilty of gross violations of human rights by virtually every UN human rights mechanism, the special procedures that you mentioned, but commissions of inquiry and others. And then it is in the United Nations, it controls millions of people, the Palestinians, who it doesn't represent. So it's there with credentials over a territory that it doesn't represent. And then it's attacking the UN itself. It is repeatedly blocked UN investigations and UN personnel and UN agencies in Palestine. It has attacked and smeared and obstructed UNRWA, the most important UN agency that's in Palestine. It even PNG'd the Secretary General for the mildest of statements. It has killed more UN staff. It has killed more UN staff than any party in history, more than 310, many of them along with their families. It has detained and tortured countless UN staff. It has regularly attacked and slandered and obstructed the organization from performing its obligations. It has targeted UN peacekeepers in Lebanon, right? It has invaded and attacked and pillaged and destroyed countless UN premises, seized others. It's bombed and destroyed UN schools and clinics and warehouses and offices. All of that, there is no precedent for a member state of the UN to carry on so much direct and sustained attacks on the UN itself, and that it walks around the corridors with full diplomatic rights and privileges of the UN. And this is my big frustration with the General Assembly. The GA should have already acted to remove Israel, knowing that it can't be done in the Security Council, knowing that there's a precedent for it, knowing that it was a very effective precedent in the South Africa case. But I'm hoping that pressure from civil society, from movements, will push this portfolio forward. Now, we have other problems with the UN. You know, we're talking about the General Assembly, and of course, the General Assembly has just elected Annalena Baerbock as its next president. This is somebody who's been directly, as a German official, directly complicit in the genocide, who has made a number of public statements justifying war crimes and crimes against humanity on behalf of the Israeli regime, who has openly dehumanized Palestinians and defiantly defended Israel's right to perpetrate all of these crimes. And she was just elected as the president of the next General Assembly, which is outrageous. It's outrageous that Germany put this character forward. It's outrageous that the Western group, which is called WEOG, are you familiar with this? The Western Europe and other groups. I always have to take a side note here. So the UN conducts its intergovernmental business through so-called regional groupings. Every regional groupings is actually a regional except one. So you have the Africa group, the Asia group, the Latin America group, the Eastern Europe group, and so on. There's one group that's not a regional group. It's called WEOG, that stands for Western Europe and Other Group. Western Europe is obvious. The other group means the white settler colonies of Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel. Right. And it used to include South Africa when it was a white supremacist apartheid state, but right. Then it left. And this is one of the main regional groups of the organization, the group that has disproportionate power in voting, that has disproportionate representation in intergovernmental bodies, including 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, even though it's a small group, that has the disproportionate number of senior UN officials coming from this group, and that has, you know, opposed indigenous rights, imposed the program against racism, opposed Palestinian rights, all the kind of predict the right to development, economic and social rights, you know. So this is the Western Europe and other group. I don't know, how do we get off on this tangent? Where was I?
No, it's not a tangent. This goes to the heart of the matter. This is extremely important, and I'm glad you went there.
They've had more secretaries general than
yeah. So I can't help asking this big picture.
Oh, that's right. Let me finish that thought. Now I remember why. Because I was saying the way that they elect presidents of the General Assembly is that each regional group, so-called, gets a turn, and it circulates through the regional groups. And the practice is that when a regional group puts forward a candidate, the other regional groups won't challenge it. They'll go along with it, just waiting for their turn. So Germany says, great, good opportunity to try to wash the reputation of this genocide complicit monster, Annalena Baerbock, and to put her in control of the General Assembly at this moment in history when the GA has really important work to do to try to stop the Israeli atrocities. And the Western group goes along with it, and the other groups don't vote against it. And so that means that even as the deadline is going to come up in September for holding Israel accountable for its crimes following the World Court decisions and so on, she's going to be presiding over the General Assembly. So this is what we are up against, and that's why that's why civil society and movements are so important. That's why other regional groupings like the BRICS are not regional, but other international groupings like the BRICS are so important. That's why the Hague group, you know, these kinds of things, and that's why efforts for states to come together to oppose this very dangerous distortion of international politics and international law is so important.
I think you've already answered the question I was going to ask you after having. I knew this conversation was going to be enlightening for me, and sure enough, it has been. I now understand much better the shenanigans of the General Assembly. But I used to be a big fan for most of my legal career. Great fan of the United Nations. conceptually and much of the work that it did. But now, Craig, I don't know. I mean, I think that I'm deeply skeptical that the reputation of this organization can be rehabilitated and it become a force for good in the world. I was going to ask you what you think about that, but then you started mentioning these other organizations, and that's where my mind automatically goes. We have to begin to build other international structures, multilateral institutions that are at least more committed, if not perfectly committed, to respect for international law and particularly human rights. Is that what your thinking is at this point in time? Do you think that the UN can be saved, or do we need to look elsewhere for justice?
I was going to say yes, and because I always say there are two UNs, right? There are the political corridors of the UN, like the Secretary General and his special advisors, and the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and the Security Council, and the Political Affairs Department. That's one UN, and that UN has dropped the ball, has lost the plot. Whatever metaphor you want to use. They have not read the UN Charter enough to understand that it's a constitutional organization, which is based upon some norms and standards of human rights and international law and international cooperation and international development and peace and security and all of that. They just triangulate power. And they say, okay, so the US is the big boss, and then we've got Europe, and then we've got China, we've got Russia. What space can we operate in without any regard to the norms and principles and standards and treaties and declarations and guidelines and bodies of principles? You know, the great legacy of the UN, that it's built up this system of rules for human rights and peacemaking and so on for years. That is just an annoyance for them. You know, when there's an anniversary of a treaty, they'll make a speech. But in the end, they are just operating on a very raw idea of geopolitics that leave behind smaller countries, weaker countries, peoples, and the rights that they have, which is why the Palestinians have suffered so much under the system. But there's another UN, Dimitri, the one that I think you have been more instinctively linked to, which is the independent human rights mechanisms like Francesca Albanese, which is the commissions of inquiry, the independent treaty bodies, which is the humanitarians who are out there trying to make people's lives better. They're a part of the UN, which is the UNRWA staff, 310 of whom were murdered with their families, who are risking everything just to try to help. And there are people inside the organization who really believe in the mission of the organization: human rights, peace and security, equality, development, and so on. But they are up against very powerful forces. I mean, that's, read my letter that I wrote in October, you get a sense of it, of those kinds of frustrations. So I wouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I see a value to international treaties, international declarations, international institutions. I see a value of collective action, of bringing states together. But if the states are just coming together to follow the orders of the most powerful, then there's no reason to have a UN. If they're coming together to balance, to counter the abuses of the most powerful, then there's value. We don't want to throw away those pieces of the organization. Now, on the political side, because they're not, they respond to the pressure they're getting from above, we need a counterbalance. And that means bringing together countries of the global south, a few law-focused countries of the global north, emerging economies, and others to try to act as a counterbalance. And that's why I think you need both of these things. It just can't be that one system. Reform is really hard in the UN because all the power for reform of the charter and the institution is in the hands of the 5 victors of the Second World War, who have veto power over even changes to the charter. But there's a lot that can be done within those better parts, those norm-based parts of the system that I think are worth saving.
Well, I'm not. Thanks to your wonderful explanation of the 2 UNs, I'm not ready to give up on the United Nations just yet. But my enthusiasm's hanging by a thread, Craig.
Yeah, me too. I feel it. Believe me, this last 19, 20 months in particular. Because if genocide is okay, then anything is okay. And international law and international institutions are wholly irrelevant.
Yeah.
If there's no red line, even at genocide, for everything to shift into gear. And, a part of the failure of the UN is by design, as you pointed out, like the veto going to the P5. That's designed into the system from the very start. It's a design flaw. It's a virus that was built into the system from the beginning. But part of it is by abdication. The Secretary General could take a more principled, stronger approach. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, all of those. But you wouldn't know it, but the UN has an Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide that was silent throughout the entire genocide because it was not politically convenient to say anything. The existence of those kinds of institutions is worse than their non-existence, because if they can only ring the alarm when it's approved by some powerful perpetrators, whether it's the US or anybody else, then it's better that they don't exist, and we look for enforcement elsewhere.
Then they become like the ICC, an instrument of imperialism rather than a forum for justice.
Exactly. It should go away. The ICC should go away if it can. And all sympathy to the ICC, which is being, its judges and its prosecutor are being directly persecuted in order to stop them from holding Israeli perpetrators to account. It is almost ground to a halt. Because of the sanctions imposed by the U.S., its email is shut down. It can't pay salaries. The organizations won't cooperate with it anymore because they're afraid of secondary sanctions and so on. So, all sympathy to them. But either do the job or go home. And if the job is only doing the bidding of the powerful states of the North, that's not justice. That's just an extension of empire. And I sure as hell didn't join the UN to be a part of the empire. I joined the UN to oppose the empire and stayed until I felt I couldn't anymore. Yeah.
Well, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you, Craig, and I hope that you can come back on to Reason to Resist and we can continue our conversation. Hopefully.
Anytime. Thank you for doing this, Dimitri. I follow your broadcasts all the time. You're making a great contribution. And with all of the wall of propaganda that comes out of corporate media, independent media is now more important than ever. So thanks for having these conversations.
Thank you. Is there a place, I know you're on Substack. Could you tell people a little bit where people, I don't know, I think you might have just recently become active on Substack, but can you tell people where they can find your work?
I'm just barely on Substack. I just sort of opened an account, and I'm looking at how to make that useful. I've been publishing a lot on Mondoweiss during the genocide because I'm sort of committed to providing tools for people who are fighting back, and Mondoweiss is a good source for that. So you can find a lot of writings there. On this issue of WEOG, I actually wrote a piece about this that you can find online at Foreign Policy in Focus. Foreign Policy in Focus. It's up there for free.
I'll put a link to it in the description of the video. I think people definitely need to. That was enlightening for me. I think people should read that article.
Worst kept secret in the United Nations, I think, but I think it's important that people understand it. I do have a website where I sort of just archive things, which is craigmokhiber.org. And and all the social media where I rant on a daily basis on X and Instagram and LinkedIn and whatever else is out there.
Well, keep up the great work, and we look forward to the next conversation. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thanks for inviting me.
And I'm coming to you from Montreal today for Reason to Resist on June 16th, 2025.